The whispers followed Winifred Porter everywhere she went in Cottonwood Springs, a dusty outpost in the Arizona Territory circa 1878. "Too plain," they'd say when they thought she couldn't hear. "That Porter girl has a face only a mother could love," they'd snicker behind gloved hands. At 22, Winifred had long since accepted her place as the town's unmarriageable daughter, the woman who would forever be passed over for prettier, more delicate flowers. The spring sun beat down mercilessly as Winifred made her way to her father's general store, her practical boots kicking up clouds of dust that settled on the hem of her simple calico dress. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back in a sensible bun, not a curl or ribbon in sight, and her face, though scrubbed clean, lacked the rosy cheeks and delicate features so prized by society. "Morning, Pa," she called, entering the store where Walter Porter was already helping a customer. The bell above the door jangled and several patrons turned to look, their gazes sliding past her as if she were merely part of the furnishings. "Ah, Winnie, there you are," her father said. "Can you take inventory in the back? The new shipments arrived yesterday." Winifred nodded, grateful for the task that would keep her away from curious eyes. She'd learned long ago to find solace in work, in being useful rather than ornamental. The back room of Porter's general store had become her sanctuary, a place where ledgers and stock lists didn't judge her by her appearance. She was halfway through counting tins of beans when the commotion started out front. Raised voices, then a crash, followed by her father's alarmed shout. Without hesitation, Winifred rushed to the storefront, stopping short at the tableau before her. A man she'd never seen before stood with his back to her, facing down 3 of the Blackwell gang, notorious cattle rustlers who'd been terrorizing the territory for months. One of them had his hand hovering near his gun, while her father stood frozen behind the counter. "I said, I don't want trouble," the stranger said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made the hair on Winifred's arms stand up. "Just buying supplies and moving on." "You're that Marshall fella," the lead Blackwell spat, "the one who put our cousin away in Tucson." "That was the law, not me," the stranger replied evenly. "Your cousin robbed a stagecoach and shot the driver. He's lucky he's not swinging from a rope." The tension in the room was palpable. Winifred's eyes darted to the shotgun her father kept beneath the counter, calculating whether she could reach it in time if things went badly. What happened next occurred so quickly she could barely process it. The lead Blackwell went for his gun, but the stranger moved with startling speed. In one fluid motion, he drew and fired, the shot deafening in the confined space. The Blackwell man howled, clutching his shoulder as his gun clattered to the floor. His companions backed away, hands raised. "Next one won't be so gentle," the stranger said, his gun still trained on them. "Now get out and take him to a doctor." The Blackwells retreated, dragging their wounded companion. Only when they were gone did the stranger holster his weapon and turn around. Winifred found herself staring into the most penetrating blue eyes she'd ever seen. "Sorry about the disruption," he said to her father. "I'll pay for any damages." Walter Porter shook his head, visibly rattled. "No need, those Blackwells have been nothing but trouble. I'm grateful you were here, Mr. Marshal Mason Marshall." He tipped his hat, revealing a shock of dark brown hair. U.S. Marshal out of Tucson. Winifred couldn't help but stare. Marshal Marshall stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite all angles and planes, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble. A thin scar ran along his left cheekbone, and his skin was bronzed from years under the western sun. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something magnetic about him. Then those blue eyes landed on her, and Winifred felt exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. She dropped her gaze, embarrassed to be caught staring. "And who might this be?" he asked, his voice softer now. "My daughter, Winifred," Walter said, gesturing toward her. Marshal Marshall stepped forward, extending a calloused hand. "Pleasure, Miss Porter." Winifred hesitantly placed her hand in his, feeling the rough texture of his palm against hers. "Thank you for your assistance, Marshal," she managed to say, surprised her voice didn't waver. He held her hand a moment longer than necessary, his gaze appraising but not unkind. "You've got steady eyes, Miss Porter. Not everyone stays calm when guns come out." The compliment, so unexpected, left her momentarily speechless. No one had ever praised anything about her appearance before, not even her eyes, which were her one decent feature, a clear hazel that sometimes appeared green in certain light. Her father broke the moment. "Will you be staying in Cottonwood Springs long, Marshal?" Mason released Winifred's hand and turned back to Walter. "A few days, perhaps. I'm tracking the rest of the Blackwell gang. Their leader, Victor Blackwell, is wanted for murder in 3 territories. You're welcome to continue your shopping," Walter said, gesturing to the shelves. "On the house, as thanks." Mason shook his head. "Can't accept that, sir. I was just doing my job." He glanced around the store. "But I do need supplies, been on the trail for weeks." As her father helped the marshal gather provisions, Winifred returned to the storeroom, but found it impossible to concentrate on inventory. Her hand still tingled where he'd touched it, and she couldn't shake the way those blue eyes had looked at her, not through her, like most people did, but at her, as if she were worth seeing. That evening, Winifred walked home alone, her thoughts still occupied by the encounter at the store. The sun was setting, painting the dusty main street in hues of orange and gold when she heard hoofbeats approaching from behind. Stepping aside to let the rider pass, she was surprised when the horse slowed beside her. "Miss Porter," Mason Marshall said, tipping his hat. "Bit late to be walking alone, isn't it?" Winifred looked up at him, shielding her eyes from the setting sun. "I've walked this road every day for years, Marshal. Nothing to fear in Cottonwood Springs." "Except the Blackwell gang," he pointed out, his expression serious. After today, they might hold a grudge against anyone associated with that store. She hadn't considered that. "I suppose you're right." Without another word, he extended his hand down to her. "Let me give you a ride home." Winifred hesitated, glancing at the large black stallion. "I've never ridden double before." A smile touched his lips, softening his stern features. "First time for everything. Come on, I promise Thunder here is gentle as a lamb." Against her better judgment, and ignoring what the town gossips would say if they saw her, Winifred took his hand and allowed him to swing her up behind him. She settled awkwardly on the horse's rump, uncertain where to put her hands. "You'll fall off that way," Mason said over his shoulder. "Hold on to me." Gingerly, she placed her hands on his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his buckskin jacket. "Where to, Miss Porter?" She directed him to the modest house she shared with her father at the edge of town. The ride took less than 5 minutes, but Winifred was acutely aware of every second, of the strange intimacy of sitting so close to this man she barely knew. When they reached her home, he dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. His hands spanned her waist easily as he lifted her, setting her gently on the ground. For a moment they stood close, too close, and Winifred found herself unable to look away from those blue eyes. "Thank you for the ride, Marshal," she said softly. "Mason," he corrected. "When I'm not on official business, it's just Mason," she nodded, stepping back to put a proper distance between them. "Good evening, then, Mason." "Good evening, Miss Porter." He mounted his horse again, but didn't immediately ride away. "I'll be staying at the hotel for a few days." "Perhaps I'll see you at the store tomorrow." "Perhaps," she agreed, though she wasn't sure why her heart quickened at the thought. He tipped his hat once more and rode off, leaving Winifred standing in front of her house, wondering what had just happened and why she suddenly felt so unsettled. The next morning, Winifred arrived at the store earlier than usual, telling herself it was to finish the inventory she'd neglected the day before, not because she was hoping to see a certain U.S. Marshal again. She was arranging a display of fabric when Mrs. Penelope Harrison and her daughter Elizabeth entered, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. "Good morning, Winifred," Mrs. Harrison said with a condescending smile. At 45, she was the self-appointed arbiter of social standing in Cottonwood Springs. We heard the most interesting rumor about a lawman stopping by yesterday. Word travels fast, Winifred remarked, continuing her work. Elizabeth, a pretty blonde of 20 whose greatest ambition was to marry well, stepped closer. They say he's quite handsome, this Marshall. Is that true? Winifred shrugged, unwilling to admit she'd found him compelling. He seemed capable at his job. Mrs. Harrison laughed, a tinkling sound that grated on Winifred's nerves. Trust our Winifred to notice a man's professional qualifications rather than his appearance. Though I suppose when one is plain oneself, one develops an eye for other qualities. The casual cruelty of the remark stung, as always, but Winifred had long since learned to hide her hurt. Was there something specific you were looking for today, Mrs. Harrison? Before the woman could answer, the door opened again, and Mason Marshall himself walked in, ducking his tall frame beneath the doorway. The room seemed to shrink in his presence. "Good morning, ladies," he said, nodding politely. Elizabeth immediately straightened, patting her already perfect curls. "Good morning, Marshall. I'm Elizabeth Harrison. This is my mother, Mrs. Penelope Harrison. We're practically the first family of Cottonwood Springs." Mason shook their extended hands with polite detachment. "Pleasure." "I see you've already met Miss Porter." "Oh, Winifred," Mrs. Harrison waved a dismissive hand. "She's been working in her father's store forever, such a dedicated shop girl." Winifred felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She wasn't ashamed of working at the store, but the way Mrs. Harrison said it made it sound like a personal failing. To her surprise, Mason's expression cooled. "Is that so? I found Miss Porter to be remarkably level-headed during a dangerous situation yesterday." Not everyone can claim such presence of mind. The unexpected defense left Mrs. Harrison momentarily speechless, and Winifred busied herself with straightening items that didn't need straightening, unsure how to respond. "Well," Mrs. Harrison finally recovered, "we're having a small gathering at our home this evening. Nothing formal, just a few friends. We would be honored if you would attend, Marshall." "That's kind of you, madam, but I'm here on official business," Mason replied. "Surely even lawmen need to eat and relax," Elizabeth chimed in, stepping closer to him. "It would be such a shame if you spent your entire visit to our town without experiencing our hospitality." Mason glanced at Winifred, who kept her eyes firmly on the shelf she was organizing. "I suppose I could stop by briefly," he conceded. "Wonderful," Mrs. Harrison clapped her hands. 7 o'clock. Everyone who's anyone in Cottonwood Springs will be there." She paused, then added with feigned afterthought, "You're welcome too, of course, Winifred, if you can spare the time from your duties here." It was a hollow invitation, and they all knew it. The Harrisons had never included Winifred in their social circles before. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison, but I have accounts to balance this evening," Winifred replied evenly. After the Harrisons had made their purchases and left, with Elizabeth casting lingering glances at Mason, the Marshal approached the counter where Winifred stood. "You're really not going?" he asked, leaning against the polished wood. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I wasn't truly invited. Mrs. Harrison was just being polite because you were here." "Didn't seem very polite to me," he observed, his voice low. Winifred gave a small shrug. "I'm used to it." "Maybe you shouldn't be." There was an edge to his words that made her look at him more closely. "Why don't you come? We could arrive together." The offer took her by surprise. "Why would you want that?" Mason studied her for a long moment. "Because I'd rather talk to someone real than spend the evening listening to social niceties from people I'll never see again after I leave this town." The honesty in his statement was refreshing, but Winifred still hesitated. "I don't have anything suitable to wear to the Harrisons." "What you're wearing now looks just fine to me." She glanced down at her simple blue dress, worn at the cuffs and mended in several places. "You don't understand. The Harrisons are the wealthiest family in town. The women will be in silks and satins. And I'll be in the same clothes I've been wearing for a week on the trail," he countered with a half smile. We'll be misfits together. The idea was tempting, not just attending the gathering, but doing so with this intriguing man at her side. Still, years of social conditioning made her wary. People will talk. Let them, Mason said with a dismissive gesture. I'll call for you at 6:30 unless you're truly set against it. Winifred knew she should refuse. Nothing good could come from stepping out of her established place in Cottonwood Springs' social hierarchy. And yet, all right, she found herself saying. 6:30. The smile that spread across his face made something flutter in her chest. I look forward to it, Miss Porter. After he left, Winifred wondered what madness had possessed her to accept his invitation. She would be stepping into the lion's den, and for what? A few hours of pretending she belonged in a world that had always excluded her. And yet, the prospect of spending an evening in Mason Marshall's company made the risk seem worthwhile. That evening, Winifred stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, scrutinizing her appearance. She'd done what she could with her one good dress of forest green cotton that had belonged to her mother. It was several years out of fashion, but it brought out the green in her hazel eyes. She'd let her hair down from its usual severe bun, allowing it to fall in soft waves past her shoulders. You look lovely, Winnie, her father said from the doorway, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. But are you sure about this? The Harrisons have never been kind to you. I'm not going for them, Pa, she admitted. And I'm not exactly sure about anything, but I want to go. Walter Porter nodded, understanding in his eyes. That Marshall seems like a good man. Just be careful with your heart, daughter. He won't be staying in Cottonwood Springs. Winifred nodded, acknowledging the truth in her father's warning. I know, it's just one evening. A knock at the front door interrupted them. Walter went to answer it, and Winifred heard the rumble of male voices conversing. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her shawl and went to meet her escort. Mason stood in the small parlor, hat in hand, engaged in conversation with her father. He'd cleaned up, his dark hair still damp from washing, and he wore a fresh shirt beneath his buckskin jacket. When he turned and saw her, a look of genuine appreciation crossed his face. Miss Porter, he said, his voice warm, you look beautiful. The compliment, spoken so sincerely, brought a flush to her cheeks. Thank you, shall we go? After promising her father they wouldn't be late, they stepped out into the evening air. Mason had brought his horse and once again helped her up behind him. I meant what I said, he told her as they rode toward the Harrison estate at the north end of town. You look beautiful tonight. Though you were lovely yesterday, too, in your work dress. Winifred wasn't sure how to respond to such unexpected praise. You don't need to say such things, Marshall. I know what I am. He reined the horse to a stop, turning in the saddle to look at her. And what is that exactly? She met his gaze steadily. Plain, unremarkable, I've heard it all my life, so you needn't pretend otherwise. Something flashed in his eyes, anger perhaps, though not directed at her. Who told you that? Everyone, she replied simply. Mrs. Harrison, her daughter, the other girls my age. Even the preacher's wife once said it was a shame I hadn't been blessed with better looks, given my sweet disposition. Mason shook his head, disgust evident on his face. Then everyone in this town is blind or cruel or both. He urged the horse forward again. Where I come from, a woman is judged by her character, her strength, her kindness, not by how dainty her features are. And where is that? She asked, curious about this man who saw the world so differently. A small ranch in Colorado, he replied. My pa raised me and my brothers after our mother died. He taught us to value what's real, not what's just for show. They rode in silence for a moment before he spoke again. The first thing I noticed about you wasn't your face, Miss Porter. It was how steady you were during that confrontation, how you assessed the situation, looked for the shotgun, calculated whether you could reach it in time. Most women would have screamed or fainted. You were ready to fight. His observation surprised her. You noticed all that. I'm trained to notice details, he said. It's kept me alive more than once. They had reached the Harrison estate, a large two-story house with gleaming windows and a manicured garden. Light spilled from every window, and the sounds of conversation and laughter drifted out onto the night air. Mason dismounted first, then helped Winifred down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her stomach was in knots. "As I'll ever be." The evening that followed was unlike any Winifred had experienced. From the moment they entered, Mason kept her at his side, his hand occasionally touching the small of her back in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. The initial shock on the Harrisons' faces when they arrived together quickly gave way to forced politeness, though Elizabeth couldn't quite hide her displeasure. "What surprised to see you, Winifred," Mrs. Harrison said, her smile tight. "I didn't think you would come." "The Marshal was kind enough to escort me," Winifred replied, keeping her voice even. "How fortunate for you," Elizabeth said, her gaze fixed on Mason. "Marshal, please let me introduce you to some of our other guests. I'm sure Winifred can find her way to the refreshment table." Before Mason could respond, a commotion at the front door drew everyone's attention. Sheriff Daniels burst in, his expression grave. "Sorry to interrupt, folks," he announced, "but I've just had word that the Blackwell gang was spotted heading this way. Seems they're looking for revenge against the Marshal who shot one of their own." A ripple of alarm went through the gathered guests. Mason immediately stepped forward. "How many?" "5 or 6, the sheriff replied, armed and angry. "I've sent for help from the next town over, but they won't be here till morning. We should move everyone to a safer location," Mason said, his voice slipping into the authoritative tone of a lawman. "The town hall has stone walls, fewer windows." As panic began to spread among the guests, Winifred noticed Elizabeth clinging to her mother, tears already forming in her eyes. Several of the men looked ready to flee rather than help. Mason turned to the sheriff. "Get these people moving. I'll scout ahead, make sure the way is clear." "I'll come with you," Winifred said, stepping forward before she could second-guess herself. Both Mason and the sheriff looked at her in surprise. "It's too dangerous, Miss Porter," Sheriff Daniels protested. "I know every back alley and shortcut in this town," she countered, "and I can shoot. My father taught me years ago." Mason studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "We could use the extra eyes and a local guide." Despite protests from Mrs. Harrison and several others about the impropriety of a woman involving herself in such dangerous matters, Winifred found herself minutes later creeping along the shadows of Cottonwood Springs Main Street beside Mason, a borrowed pistol in her hand. "Stay close," he murmured as they moved from building to building. "If we see any of the Blackwells, we observe only. No confrontations unless absolutely necessary." The night was eerily quiet, most residents already in their homes or unaware of the danger. As they approached the town hall, Winifred spotted movement across the street, the unmistakable silhouettes of mounted men moving slowly, guns drawn. She tugged Mason's sleeve, pointing silently. He nodded, drawing her deeper into the shadows of the alley they were traversing. "4 of them," he whispered. "Looks like they're setting up an ambush near the town hall. They must have guessed where people would go for safety." "There's another way," Winifred whispered back. "Behind the livery stable, there's a side entrance to the town hall. It's rarely used." Mason squeezed her arm in approval. "Go back to the Harrisons. Tell the sheriff to bring everyone the long way around behind the livery. I'll keep an eye on the Blackwells." "I'm not leaving you alone," she protested. "This isn't a debate, Winifred," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I need you to guide those people safely." The use of her first name, spoken with such warmth even in this dangerous moment, made her pause. Finally, she nodded. "Be careful." "Always am," he replied with a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Winifred retraced their steps, moving as quickly and quietly as she could. When she reached the Harrison estate, she found the sheriff organizing the frightened guests into a procession. Marshal Marshall spotted Blackwell and his men setting up an ambush near the main entrance of the town hall, she reported, ignoring the whispers her appearance generated. "He says to bring everyone around behind the livery to the side entrance." Sheriff Daniels nodded, adjusting his plans accordingly. As the group began to move out, Winifred found herself face to face with Elizabeth Harrison. "Where is the marshal?" Elizabeth demanded, her voice high with fear. "Watching the Blackwells," Winifred replied shortly, turning to help an elderly woman who was struggling to keep pace. "You left him alone." Elizabeth's accusation was sharp. "How could you?" Winifred whirled back, her patience at an end. "He ordered me to bring this information back to save your lives. And unlike some, I'm actually being useful instead of just being afraid." The journey to the town hall was tense but uneventful. The sheriff led them on a circuitous route through back alleys and service paths, many of which Winifred had suggested. When they finally reached the side entrance, Sheriff Daniels organized men to guard the doors while women and children were settled in the main hall. But Mason was nowhere to be seen. "He should have been here by now," Winifred said to the sheriff, anxiety growing in her chest. "Maybe he's still keeping an eye on the Blackwells," Sheriff Daniels suggested. Though he looked concerned as well, Winifred made a decision. "I'm going to find him." The sheriff caught her arm. "That's not wise, Miss Porter." "Neither is leaving him out there alone," she retorted, pulling free. "I know this town better than anyone. I can move without being seen." Before anyone could stop her, she slipped back out into the night. Retracing the path to where she'd left Mason, Winifred kept to the deepest shadows, her heart pounding in her ears. The borrowed pistol was a reassuring weight in her hand. She had nearly reached their previous position when she heard voices, angry, threatening voices coming from a narrow passage between two buildings. Moving cautiously closer, she peered around the corner. Mason stood with his back against a wall, facing 3 members of the Blackwell gang. His gun was on the ground beside him, and blood trickled from a cut on his temple. The largest of the men, presumably Victor Blackwell himself, had a pistol aimed at Mason's chest. "You're going to pay for shooting my brother," Blackwell growled, "and for interfering in our business." "Your business is stealing and killing," Mason replied, his voice steady despite his precarious position. "It had to end somewhere." "Well, it's ending here for you," Blackwell said with a cruel laugh. "Any last words, Marshal?" Winifred didn't hesitate. Stepping into view, she raised her pistol and fired a warning shot into the air. "Let him go." The Blackwells spun around, momentarily startled by her appearance. It was all the distraction Mason needed. In one fluid motion, he dove for his gun, rolling to the side as shots rang out. What followed was chaos. Winifred fired again, aiming at the nearest Blackwell, who howled as the bullet grazed his arm. Mason had regained his weapon and was exchanging fire with Victor Blackwell, both men taking cover behind barrels at opposite ends of the alley. The third Blackwell charged toward Winifred, but before he could reach her, she aimed and fired again. This time her shot found its mark, hitting him in the shoulder and sending him crashing to the ground. "Winifred, get down!" Mason shouted. She dropped just as a bullet whizzed over her head. Rolling behind a stack of crates, she tried to steady her breathing. The sound of approaching hoofbeats told her more riders were coming, whether friend or foe, she couldn't tell. Suddenly, Sheriff Daniels' voice boomed from the street. "Blackwell, you're surrounded. Throw down your weapons." A stream of curses from Victor Blackwell was followed by more gunfire, then silence. Winifred held her breath, straining to hear what was happening. Then Mason's voice called out, clear and strong. "It's over. Blackwell's down." Cautiously, Winifred emerged from her hiding place. Mason stood over Victor Blackwell, who lay groaning on the ground, clutching a wounded leg. The other gang members were being rounded up by the sheriff and several armed townsmen. When Mason saw her, he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into a fierce embrace. "You crazy, beautiful woman," he murmured against her hair. "You could have been killed." She leaned into his warmth, her arms wrapping around his waist. "So could you?" He drew back just enough to look at her face, his blue eyes intense in the moonlight. "I've never met anyone like you, Winifred Porter." Before she could respond, they were surrounded by townspeople. all clamoring to thank Mason and, to Winifred's surprise, to congratulate her on her bravery. Sheriff Daniels clapped Mason on the back and even tipped his hat to Winifred. "Never would have thought our shopkeeper's daughter had that kind of courage," he remarked, genuine admiration in his voice. In the days that followed, Winifred found herself viewed differently in Cottonwood Springs. People who had never given her a second glance now greeted her on the street. Mrs. Harrison, chastened by her own cowardice during the crisis, was notably less condescending. Even Elizabeth regarded her with a newfound, if grudging, respect. But the most significant change was in Winifred herself. Standing up to the Blackwell gang had awakened something in her, a confidence, a certainty in her own worth that had nothing to do with her appearance. A week after the showdown, Mason came to the store as Winifred was closing up for the evening. He'd stayed in town to testify at the Blackwell's preliminary hearing, but now his official business was concluded. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said without preamble, his expression uncharacteristically somber. "Heading back to Tucson to report." Winifred nodded, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest. She'd known this day was coming. "I hope you have a safe journey." "Come with me," he said suddenly, the words rushing out as if he'd been holding them back. "Not to Tucson, that's no place for you, but to Colorado." "To my family's ranch." She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" Mason stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I know it's sudden. We've only known each other a short time, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Winifred. Your courage, your intelligence, your quiet strength, the way you see what needs doing and do it without fanfare." Winifred's heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Mason, the things people have said about me my whole life were wrong," he interrupted firmly. "Dead wrong. When I look at you, I don't see plain or unremarkable. I see the most beautiful woman I've ever known, inside and out. But your job, your life as a marshal, I've been thinking about that too," he admitted. "I've been a lawman for 8 years. Maybe it's time for a change. My older brother has been running the ranch alone since Pa died. He's been asking me to come back, help expand the operation." His grip on her hands tightened. "I want a life with you, Winifred. A home, a family. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night." Tears filled Winifred's eyes. "I've never been wanted like this before," she whispered. Mason cupped her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear that had escaped. "Then everyone in this town is a fool. Because you, Winifred Porter, are a treasure. My treasure if you'll have me." In that moment, all the years of feeling invisible, of being passed over and dismissed, seemed to fall away. Winifred saw herself reflected in Mason's eyes, not plain, not unremarkable, but precious and cherished. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with certainty. "Yes, I'll go with you. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. Bending down, he kissed her tenderly at first, then with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt your worth again," he promised. 2 weeks later, after a simple ceremony in Cottonwood Springs' small church, Winifred Porter became Winifred Marshall. Her father, tearful but supportive, gave her away and promised to visit them in Colorado as soon as the store could spare him. As they rode out of town together on Mason's black stallion, Winifred wrapped her arms around her husband's waist and pressed her cheek against his strong back. Behind them lay a lifetime of being overlooked and undervalued. Ahead stretched the promise of a future where she was seen, appreciated, and loved for exactly who she was. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Marshall?" Mason asked, covering her hands with one of his. Winifred smiled, watching Cottonwood Springs grow smaller in the distance. "Just that sometimes treasures are found in the most unexpected places." Mason's laugh rumbled through his chest beneath her cheek. "And sometimes, what others call plain turns out to be the most precious thing in the world." Under the vast expanse of the western sky, they rode toward their new life together, a life built not on fleeting beauty or social status, but on courage, respect, and a love that saw beyond appearances to the true worth within.